Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes. In this season of the Subverse, our focus is on Earth, a pale blue dot, our planet, our home. To kick off the season, we have a very special treat. Our first episode is on the story of sound on Earth, and the guest leading us through the sonic evolution is David George Haskell. David is a writer and biologist, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and winner of multiple awards. His book Sounds Wild and Broken starts with the origins of animal song, traversing the whole arc of Earth history, and is a celebration and paean to life and sound. I love an earlier profile of David I read by James Gorman in the New York Times, which said that he thinks like a biologist, writes like a poet, and gives the natural world the kind of open-minded attention one expects from a Zen monk, rather than a hypothesis-driven scientist. I can't do a better description than that, except also offer my gratitude at his joining us in the space and for his generosity in doing this interview. He writes in his book Sounds Wild and Broken that it was in the infant years of the universe, when inside the early plasma, inside that furnace where sound was born, ancient acoustic waves then seeded stars, and we are also made from these remnants. And as he writes, from inside ancient sound, we listen. Sound has always been a creative force, and 13 billion years after the plasma cooled, sound met its new creative partner, life on Earth. As he writes, from the thrum of bacteria to the effusion of animal voices to human music in concert halls, ours is a sonic planet full of listeners and communicative voices. In this conversation, David leads us through the wonders of Earth's living voices, the diversity, the sophistication, the anatomies of hearing and vocalization, and the wondrous pit stops along the way where biological and other marvels laid the path for this flourishing of sound. Listening to David talk about sound, I felt transported, connected to the earth. It just reminded me of how sensorial Earth is and how fortunate we are to live in the sonic realm. The learning in this episode for me was nothing short of extraordinary. So I hope you feel the same after you listen. David, I'd like to warmly welcome you to the Subverse. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Susan. It's such a pleasure to join you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. In your book, Sounds Wild and Broken, which for me, I have to just say was such a phenomenal read, you write that about 3.5 billion years ago, sunlight found a new path to sound, life. In the murmurs of cells and the voices of animals, we hear solar energy refracted into sound. And human language and music are part of this flow. But these wonders of Earth's living voices are of recent origin, and they are fragile, especially given that hundreds of millions of years of animal evolution unfolded in communicative silence. Can you tell us about what powered this sonic evolution, both in biological and cultural terms? And how did that diversify and become sophisticated over time?
Thank you for that question. I love the phrasing of putting things into the context of deep time, because sound has an interesting trajectory as the planet evolved. There were sound waves in the universe long before planet Earth happened. A sound wave is a pressure wave, can move through air or solid or liquid. And of course, pressure waves were present in the early universe. And then when the planets first formed, and on planet Earth, sound was present right at the beginning with geologic tremors. And when water first formed, there were wind and waves. And yet sound really found its fullest and richest expression once life evolved. And in the living world, the sound has this very strange quality, and that sound is very ephemeral. Like it reaches us, and then as soon as it arrives, boom, it's gone. You hear a voice, and then it's gone. And yet, sound has lasting effects that last for decades. And in terms of biological evolution, sometimes hundreds of millions of years. So the most ephemeral stuff on Earth has some of the longest lasting effects. There's an interesting tension there and an interesting paradox. In your question, you mentioned a sort of long prehistory of sound. And what's striking to me as a biologist is that there's no evidence whatsoever for the first 9/10 of life's evolution that there was any communicative sound. And by communicative, I mean a song or speech or a call whose intent is to change the behavior of another creature, like when a frog gives a warning call and the other frogs jump into the pond to escape a predator, or a bird is singing to its mate, or people, other animals are communicating with languages. All of that is communicative, and yet there's no evidence for any communication. For example, in early on in evolution, for bacterial life, we know that bacteria make sounds. They make little tremors that flow out, and other bacteria respond to those tremors by growing a little faster. And so bacteria are making sound and they're responding to sound, but there's no evidence that they're communicating with sound, like singing to a mate or shouting a warning signal. And bacteria are probably mostly communicating just using chemical signals. And then when complex animals evolved, same thing. There's no evidence of any of the early fossils on life of any structure that could make a sound, like a ridge and a file or a drum or other structures in later fossils and in living animals that are used to make sound. So it was probably that sound was just much too dangerous to use as a communicative device. For example, even today, if we look at, say, frogs, they make calls, they make songs, and yet they can get away from predators. They got powerful jumping legs. And so for them, the cost of making a sound is actually quite low. Whereas for a salamander or a jellyfish or a worm, they can't get away from predators as easily. They're defenseless, and so they're silent. So for about 9/10 of Earth's history, there was communicative silence. And then, and this is the great under-celebrated moment in Earth's history, insects evolved wings. And those wings, of course, allowed insects to fly and move around, all sorts of great advantages to be able to fly. But a secondary advantage was those wings were papery structures attached to vibratory muscles, just like a loudspeaker in a hi-fi system or radio, or even in earbuds or in earphones, is a little paper structure that vibrates back and forth. And here we have the insects, papery wings attached to vibratory muscles. And lo and behold, in the fossil record, we see on some of those wings little raised ridges that have lots of bumps along them. And by rubbing those wings together, the insect could make a sound just like modern bush crickets and katydids do today. Ancient insects were doing the same. And so the very first fossil evidence we have of any communicative sound on planet Earth is from about 275 million years ago, from an insect called Permostridulus that had a raised ridge. Now, it could be that there are other insects, other fossils. So for anyone who's interested in collecting or studying fossils, I think this is an interesting motivation to relook at some of the earlier insect fossils and then to go and find some fossil deposits that would have these communicative sound-making devices in them. So the insects are the ones that started it all off, singing. And when we listen to insect choruses, and here I'm speaking, and I live now in Atlanta, Georgia, in the southern United States. And here it's mostly in the late summer and the autumn where the insect chorus gets really loud. It's actually louder than standing next to a busy road because there are so many thousands of insects pumping out their sound. And, in winter, it mostly goes quiet. On a warm day in the middle of winter, maybe we'll hear a few insects, but mostly it's that great late summer thunder. When I hear that now, I imagine I'm being transported in a little time machine all the way back to the earliest days of communicative sound on planet Earth. So the insects started it off. Then we have the frogs and the birds and the mammals and all kinds of interesting later additions of which we are one part. But a sketch of the story of sound on Earth goes from silence and the sound of wind and rocks and waves, sounds that we can still hear today, moving into sounds of insects and then of other animals.
David, if I may just ask, and what was happening in the oceans?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for pointing out. I sort of missed out the oceans in that, partly because we don't know very much about what was happening in the ocean. So, for example, in the fossil record, there are more recent fossils of crabs and of fish and things from the last 100 million years that have little bony struts and things that they make sound with. They rub them together to make sound. But in the older fossils, we don't see any evidence of that whatsoever. So it could be that the early oceans, there were the sounds of fish swimming around and crabs and their ancestors running and trilobites and other things scraping in the mud and so on. But there's no evidence that they're making any communicative sound. A couple of contenders for early singers in the oceans for the invertebrates are the spiny lobsters. And we still see these lobsters in warmer waters around the world now. They're the big lobsters with all kinds of crazy spines and protuberances on them. And it turns out they can rub the base of their antennae against a groove on their forehead. Kind of a strange way of making a sound, but it works for them. And when they rub that, it's almost like a violin bow going over violin strings. It makes a very loud sound that can be heard hundreds of meters away. And they evolved maybe 200, 250, maybe even earlier than that. Million years ago, they were making some sounds, probably. So they may have been some of the first communicative sound singers, sound makers. Other creatures like sturgeon and other fish that, there are still living sturgeon with us today, but they belong to a family that branched off very early in fish evolution. And today they make these rumbling sounds when they're doing their mating. So it could be that the sturgeon and other primitive fish were making sounds way back in the ancient oceans. But most of the sound-making creatures today in the oceans and indeed in fresh water, like some fish, snapping shrimp, crabs, and certainly the marine mammals, they all were much more recent, just in the last 100 million years, and some of them just in the last tens of millions of years. So the oceans, lots of waves, lots of sounds of earthquakes, all kinds of noise in the oceans, but song and communicative sound came much later. Weirdly, though, and this is the thing that I love to remind myself of, we are still, in a way, we humans are still aquatic creatures when we listen. Because when I'm hearing things, of course, the air is coming through my ear and it hits the eardrum and makes the little ear bones wiggle. And all of that transmits vibrations to the inner ear, that coil that physicians call the cochlea, the little snail. We have two of them buried inside our skulls. Inside the cochlea is a fluid that is very much like seawater. And in that fluid are tiny little hair cells that pick up the pressure waves that we then perceive as sound. And so when we listen, we're hearing as aquatic beings. And so we carry little drops of seawater in our ears. And so we're not so different from the fish. In fact, from an evolutionary point of view, we are fish that are just running around on land. And our ears are essentially fish ears that have become a little more coiled more recently in our evolution. There's a unity there in the little hair cells in my ears with the fish, but also unity with the insects that also, although they don't have ears the way we do, they have the same little hairs at the base of their antennae and in the joints of their legs and all sorts of other places around their bodies. So the process of hearing is actually an experience of unity. There's a cellular unity behind all experiences of hearing that I find really quite delightful and also moving, because it reminds us that we are, in a very distant way, all kin to one another on this planet, whether we are birds or fish or humans or insects.
Thank you so much, David, and for reminding us of our fishy beginnings. And I have to say here that there's also the role of flowers, which I found absolutely fascinating in your book, in terms of what that did to sonic creativity.
Yes, there are several interesting and unexpected connections in the evolution of sound. And one of them are flowers. And actually, my next book, the one I'm working on now, actually expands on this theme. I've enamored with flowers. And flowers, I think we appreciate them for their beauty, but we should also appreciate them for their power and their creativity. Because when flowers evolved on planet Earth, nothing ever again was the same. And in particular, the sounds of the earth really expanded and diversified. So, and that seems like an improbable connection, right? Flowers are silent. How could they possibly increase the diversity of sound? Well, when flowers evolved, they caused a great diversification in insects, many of which are singing insects. Even if the insects are not directly pollinating the flowers the way moths and butterflies and bees do, they are indirectly benefiting from flowering plants' great productivity and resilience. So if you look at most forests, say, tropical forest or temperate deciduous forest, almost all the plants there are flowering plants. And look at human crops, rice and wheat and oats and barley, and it's all flowering plants. So we live on a planet now that is sustained by these flowering plants. So flowering plants evolved. They caused a great diversity of insects to evolve. They increased the productivity of ecosystems. Then supported things like birdsong. If you look at the diversification of birds, it very closely tracks the diversification of flowering plants on the planet. And so even most birds, there are a few birds, sunbirds and hummingbirds that drink nectar, but most birds are only indirectly benefiting from flowers by eating caterpillars and all the other good things that flowering plants provide to ecosystems. If we took flowering plants away, most of the diversity of song on this planet would disappear. So flowering plants led to this knock-on effect, if you like, secondary effect, which was that the soundscapes of our planet became extraordinarily rich. Another really interesting and important connection, I think, an unexpected series of events in evolution is in our own lineage, the mammalian lineage. So when the mammals first evolved, we were essentially just sort of reptilian in many of our characteristics. But what makes a mammal? Well, we're furry, and most mammals are warm-blooded, and our group is named for the key quality, which is mammary glands. So the gift of lactation, the gift of milk from mothers to their infants, help the little baby mammals grow really fast in a way that reptiles just can't, because the mother does the difficult job of finding food and processing it through her gut. And then she provides an extraordinary gift to her youngsters, which is this very easy to digest milk that takes different forms in different species of mammal, of course, but all mammals have it. Well, to receive the milk, the little baby mammals re-evolved their jaw and their throat to be able to suckle. Because, most reptiles have very weak mouths. They can't suck to receive the milk quite as well. So early on in mammalian evolution, our jaw and the muscles of our jaw and the muscles in our mouth, our tongue, but also the hidden bone under our jaw, the hyoid bone, which is a U-shaped bone. And if you don't push too hard because you'll hurt yourself, but if you run your finger under your jaw while your chin is extended, sometimes you can feel the top edge of the hyoid bone. It's a U-shaped bone in our throat, and our throat is attached to it, our voice box, and the muscles of the tongue and the jaw are all centered on the hyoid bone. And in mammals, that hyoid bone became strong and complex, and the muscles attached to it became strong and complex in order to suckle. However, evolution is sneaky and innovative and said, well, what else can we do with this? And then mammals, of course, have an extraordinarily complex jaw, which is used to shape sound. So as I'm speaking, I'm using all of those muscles and all of those bones. And when an elk or a deer makes its mating call, it's also using all of those muscles. When a wolf or a dog howls, they're also using the hyoid bone and the muscles of the tongue and the throat. Or even a little mouse or rat, when they make their ultrasonic squeaks, we can't hear them, but they're singing to one another in the ultrasound. They use the same set of upper vocal tract muscles and bones. So we have our great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers to thank for our voices, because without lactation, we would still have the very simple hyoid bone and jaw of reptiles, and we'd be able to hiss and grunt the way living reptiles do, but we wouldn't be able to do all the sophisticated things that humans can do, but not just humans, all other mammals as well.
I found the section on this absolutely fascinating. But as you mentioned in your book, it's different for birds.
Yes, birds. I'm always grateful to live on a planet with birds because they're this alternative way in which the vertebrate capacity to make song has evolved. So when I speak or when we hear a cow or a dog, we're all using a voice box in the throat and then shaping it with our mouths. Birds have a sound-producing organ that no other species on the planet has. It's called a syrinx, and it is located down in their chest, where the two bronchi, so those are the tubes from the lungs and the air sacs, where they meet and join together to make the trachea, which comes up and out of the mouth. At that meeting point, there are some little membranes. And in many birds, there are dozens of tiny muscles. And some of those muscles are as small or smaller than a grain of rice. Add tension or slack or change the shape of the membranes. And as air flows through there, the bird makes the air vibrate with these little membranes. So through this structure that, I mean, imagine in a songbird, it's only the size of a bean. This tiny little structure with unimaginably small muscles and membranes is imparting sound to the air that then comes out of the bird's beak, and the bird shapes it with the beak and the upper vocal tract a little bit, but most of the sound is coming from deep down in their chest, a unique sound-making organ that, as far as we know, evolved about 60, 70 million years ago. That's where the first fossils are found from. Which means that for the first several tens of millions of bird evolution, there was no syrinx. So if you could time travel back to the Cretaceous or the Jurassic, there would be birds there. They'd look a little strange. Some of them still had teeth in their beaks and claws on their hands and things like that. But they wouldn't be singing. So we'd be in a forest filled with birds, but no bird song at dawn. Very, very strange. And then about 69 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth, a great cataclysm. And luckily for us, our ancestors made it through, and so did the ancestors of the singing birds. And so what we're hearing in the bird song is resurgence after great calamity. That probably 90% of all the birds went extinct. But the few that made it through, the lucky ones, and it was probably a coincidence, they just happened not to be at the place where the meteorite hit and got smashed with the forest fires and things like that. Those lucky ones then diversified over time and gave us all the different bird families that we have living today with their extraordinarily diverse songs that, of course, I mean, the birds evolved to communicate with each other, but we humans get so much pleasure from their songs. Of course, they're in lots of human music and poetry, and they also form the soundscape or the soundtrack for home. Like when we grew up in a particular place, so I grew up in France, in Western Europe, and when I hear the birds of a city park, and we lived in an apartment block, and there was, in the springtime, there was really just a blackbird that used to sing there, not many other birds. When I hear that sound, I'm transported back to my childhood. So birdsong, in a way, strangely, is a compass carried in human memory that orients us back home. And that compass, includes other sounds, the sounds of the city and of human music and human voices. But birdsong is often a very important part of that. And of course, for each of us, it's marvelously different depending on which continent and city you grew up in.
We'll be back after a break. I think this leads so beautifully to my next question, which is, that in the animal sounds around us, we hear the diverse physicality of the world. And each medium has its acoustic properties, be it air, water, or ground. You write on the rainforest. The forest slaps my body awake. I'm immersed not only in the manifestations of life's diversity, but in the experience of life's ongoing creativity. The overwhelming press of sound and other senses here is one of evolution's most powerful generative forces. And elsewhere you write in the book that much of the sonic diversity of the world is then rooted in the divergent social lives of animals, along with the happenstances of history, populating different regions with varied branches of the tree of life, yielding diverse geographies of sound. And we humans are not unique, including on how we insist on a monopoly on music. Every species has a logic, a grammar to its sound making. Can you share your thoughts with us on these amazing elements in your book?
Yeah, so I mean, for human music, we often have this idea that it's an experience that is really just about our own species, like our creativity and our beauty that we create. And that's true. Partly that's true, right? So when we listen to human music, we're connected to the artistry of the musicians, the creativity of the composers, the craftsmanship of the people who made the musical instruments. So all of those are really extraordinarily and in many ways unique to humans. There are no other species that craft musical instruments the way we do. There are some cockatoos that shape sticks to use as percussive devices. Orangutans use leaves to make kissing sounds. But those are relatively simple ways of using tools to make music. And yet, in another way, human music belongs right in the larger set of music of the world. So when we listen to musical instruments, we're often hearing the sound of vibrating wood. So we are connected in a very intimate way to the lives of forests and the particular characteristics of some trees or other trees that are used to make different musical instruments. We're also connected even in electronic music. I have a digital electronic piano. And when I plug that into the wall, well, I'm using coal or nuclear power, which is part that came from the earth to power the electronics in my little keyboard. And so I'm connecting to the earth through my keyboard. And when I'm playing on the keys, which are made out of plastic, that plastic is oil, which is ancient algae that photosynthesized and eventually got turned into oil that we turned into plastic. So even in the more electronic side of music, we're connected to the living earth. And then in the form of our music as well. Of course, music takes many different forms across cultures and within cultures, but all music is in relationship to the space in which it's played. So, for example, if we're in a very big, echoey space, a very reverberant cathedral or temple or cave, we tend to make music that sounds good in that space. It tends to be slow and melodic and allows the reverberations to play. If we're in a much smaller place or a place with a lot of carpet and wall hangings and fabric, there's not much reverberation. And so we can play all sorts of very rapid virtuosic sounds, whether it's on violin, electric guitar, all sorts of music. That music would sound terrible in a reverberant cave. And so human music has a very deep but often underappreciated relationship to the space in which it's played. But that same relationship is present, say, in birdsong. Because when birds who live in forests are making their song, they generally sing fairly slow, whistled melodies. And that's because when the song moves into the forest, it gets bounced around by all the tree trunks and the leaves. It gets smeared and degraded as it passes through the dense vegetation. So in order for their signal, their song, to flow through the forest, the birds slow down and they whistle relatively simple melodies. Birds that live in open country, like in the prairies, any open grasslands, sing very rapid, songs because they can get away with all that kind of rapid virtuosity in a way that forest-dwelling birds can't. Birds on the seashore, where there's lots of wind and waves, a lot of kind of low frequency roaring sound, tend to have very loud songs and calls that are high pitched so they can be heard above the roar of the waves. So birds, and this is true for whales in the ocean and insects singing in different kinds of wood, each species makes a music that is adapted to its home. And the same is true of human music. So within cultures and across cultures, we make music that reflects the ecology and the physical space of home. So when I listen to human music now, I'm thinking, of course, about the music itself, but also the story behind the music. Why is this music taking this form in this space and not some other direction? And in that, we get to understand how human music is a music of belonging in a physical and ecological sense.
Thank you so much, David. And if you could also speak to geographies, because you also look at how the planet broke up and how that influenced sound.
Yes, so we hear deep time in the diversity of sounds. So probably the best example of this is the soundscape of Australia and Papua New Guinea, which were once all one set of islands or one landmass, compared to other continents, say, the Americas or Asia and Europe. And if you listen to the bird song in each place, it actually has its own feeling to it. It sounds very different. And with just a snatch of bird song, you could identify, oh, I'm here somewhere in Australia versus I'm in North America, Southern Asia, or Northern Europe. Whereas each place has its own vibe. It's almost like a different genre of music, right? When you hear different kinds of music, you immediately sort of know which geography and which place and which era we're talking about. So why is that? Well, it turns out that for songbirds, like little finches and warblers and flycatchers, they first evolved in Australia. And the same is true for parrots. They first evolved in Australia. And only after they'd evolved did a few of them migrate from Australia. So they essentially emigrated and moved first into Asia, and then from Asia into Africa and Northern Asia and Europe, and then across eventually into the Americas, across what is now the Bering Straits. So when we listen to songbirds and parrots today, we're hearing a subset of emigrants from Australia, which is sort of an odd way of thinking about birdsong. But really, if you look at the scale of tens of millions of years, that's what happened. And then in Australia, there are all these birds that sound almost like, very modern electronic music, kind of clashing and electronic, sharp, silvery sounds, big whooping sounds. It's very dynamic, very loud place. And that's because Australia still retains some of the earliest branches of the bird evolutionary tree in the songbirds and the parrots. And we have the legacy, the acoustic legacy of that ancient family still present there. When we listen on other continents, we're hearing a subset that then evolved to fit in with the forests and the open prairies and the mountains and so on of each of the other continents that they emigrated to. So we can hear the legacy of those ancient movements around the planet. And it's most prominent in birds. In crickets, on the other hand, crickets are really good at transporting themselves from one continent to another. Say, a log on one continent washes out to ocean and it has a few crickets on it. And eventually it makes it across the ocean and the crickets land, say they move from Africa to South America. This happens all the time on floating mats of vegetation. So crickets can get from one continent to another quite easily. And that means the continents sound quite similar. I mean, every continent has its own species, but they all sound kind of the same because they share fairly recent common ancestry. Compared to the birds, where, say, emigrating from Australia to South America, that's a pretty rare thing for a bird to do. And so we hear the legacy of those few, mostly ancient patterns of emigration. These days, in the last few hundred years, with sort of global trade and colonization and all the sort of beauty and deep brokenness of that, we have been moving species around the planet at an extraordinary rate. So now in most cities, you can hear birds that are indigenous to the region, but also birds that have moved quite recently from other continents.
And David, if I may also ask, what's also happening under the oceans? You write about the deep sound channel, which I thought was just incredible.
Yeah, the deep sound channel is this. It's hard for human mind to imagine this. But if we were whales under the ocean and we were about a kilometer deep, there is a channel in the ocean where sound can travel thousands of kilometers. The way this works is when sound gets into the channel, if the sound waves go up or down, they get bent back into this channel by gradients of temperature and salinity. So essentially, it's this long-distance communication channel. If I were a humpback whale off the coast of Africa, say, making a song, that song could potentially be heard in southern parts of Asia, or even if I was on the other side of South Africa, it could be heard in South America. So potentially, whale songs are being transmitted all across the ocean because of these deep sound channels. So there's sort of a global unity in sonic communication. It also means that if we humans are making noise in one place, that noise then goes out everywhere. And of course, human shipping, seismic exploration, when we're doing oil exploration, makes an enormous amount of noise. And that noise travels literally thousands of kilometers and disturbs animals, sometimes so loud it drives them to distraction or actually hurts them physiologically.
Thank you, David. And I think, again, this has led really well to my final question, which is, in the book, you write so poignantly that the diverse sounds of the world are now in crisis. Our species is both an apogee of sonic creativity and the great destroyer of the world's acoustic riches. We are becoming, and we are, great silencers. Part of this is because we live embedded within sensory distortion. The world is speaking, but our bodies are unable to hear much of what surrounds us. But for the rest, we get louder, noisier, and diminished soundscapes through destruction of forests, wetland, and ocean habitats. And as you write, our actions are bequeathing the future an impoverished sensory world. And as wild sounds disappear forever and human noise smothers other voices, Earth becomes less vital, blander. We extinguish the voice of other species and of indigenous communities who have been stewards in these now increasingly fragile spaces. In these contexts, how do we come back to a mode of listening, both a listening in terms of its poetics and also in terms of its politics?
Yes, thank you. And I think poetics and politics are deeply connected. We tend to think of experiences of beauty and of creativity as somehow separate from politics and ethics, but I think they're deeply intertwined. And I think sound offers us a good lesson in why that is, that if we become, as you said, sort of disconnected from the sensory manifestations of the living world, our ethical impulses and our ethical thinking and rationality have very little to work with. How can we be good kin and neighbors if we're not listening? So appreciation of the sensory diversity of the world, I think, is a necessary first step for deciding what is right or wrong and how we individually, but also collectively, should respond to the earth. So now in a globalized society, that's quite hard. So if I look around in my house, most of the things, whether it's books or the laptop that I'm using now, or even something as simple as a pen that I pick up to write with, where did that come from? Quite possibly somewhere on an entirely different continent, or if not a different continent, certainly somewhere out of sight and therefore beyond the reaches of my senses. I can't smell or hear or see the consequences of my actions. By severing our senses from experiencing the world as we're creating it, we have really cut ourselves loose from a hope of doing the right thing. Because I think as human beings, we're not brains in jars. We're embodied sensory beings, and we need our senses to be able to help us discern right from wrong and make those ethical choices. We have really great cultural traditions of gathering together to listen to and celebrate music, whether it's popular music or sacred music. How about as a species if we gathered together to celebrate the voices of non-human beings? So when the first insects start to sing in the warmer months, or the return of migratory birds and we first hear their song, or other manifestations of the great diversity and glory that are the soundscapes of the earth. And these celebrations can, of course, include and involve the wonderful ways in which human sounds are part of the soundscapes. But we live in cultures often that forget to celebrate the sounds of non-human beings. So I think it's something as simple as gathering as families or communities to notice and to celebrate soundscapes can really help reorient us and can help younger generations develop that inner compass that I talked about earlier of what is the sound of home. So then when things change, we notice, we are moved through our senses and our emotions, and then we can act. In the environmental movement, we often think about things as problems as being about statistics, right? Or chemistry, like the parts per million of mercury or carbon dioxide, or the rates of increase and decrease. And those are important things. We are sensory beings. So the sensory crisis, the loss of the sensory diversity of the world, I think needs to be drawn into the center of what it is to think about environmental crisis, including environmental justice. Because, say, noise, I talked a little bit about noise in the oceans, but noise in and around where we live and work, we humans live and work, is an enormous public health problem and an enormous source of injustice. So often we think of noise as just an inconvenience or an annoyance. But in fact, if we're in a place with a lot of unwanted noise, it inflames our body from within. Our blood pressure goes up. Heart disease becomes more likely. Diabetes becomes more likely. Noise quite literally hurts us, and it hurts our brain development and our learning as well. And often it is the disempowered communities that have most noise imposed on them. So if, at least here in the United States, and this is true in many other places as well, go to a wealthy part of town, and often it is much quieter, and there is bird song, and the soundscape is quite pleasant and relaxing compared to other places which may be poorer, closer to busy highways and trains and industry. And so noise isn't just about helping the whales and the birds and the insects. It's also about building a more just society for humans. So I think part of the sonic crisis is the fact that we are silencing ecosystems by destroying forests and parts of the ocean. But also the crisis is one of excess noise, of too much noise being pumped into the oceans and into habitats. And we humans, we receive that pollution. So noise reminds us that we belong on this planet with all these other creatures. We feel the effects of noise too.
Thank you, David. In fact, when you speak about environmental justice, especially in your last chapters, you also speak about the role of computerized recording devices. I would like to hear more about this because I think this is going to be even more ubiquitous and more present as time passes.
Yeah, so it's extraordinary just in the last 10 years how technology has advanced, that now with a little pocket recording device of, about the size of a pack of matches or a pack of cards, you can have a little recording device that you put on a tree or on a lamppost that will record audio recordings 24 hours a day for 7 days a week for months on end. You can then feed that recording into a computer that will look for statistical patterns. And so conservationists have starting to use these sound recordings to assess, for example, whether forests are being well managed. So, for example, now in whether it's local or national conservation agreements, is often an attempt to encourage good forest management, where if we're going to do some logging, let's do it in a way that doesn't hurt biodiversity. Well, how do you measure biodiversity? That's a very hard thing to measure. Well, if you record the forest, you've got thousands of different species, whether it's frogs and monkeys and birds and insects, all making sound. That soundscape gives you a little glimpse into the biodiversity of the forest. So people are using remote sound recording to compare different types of forest management and to make recommendations about which kinds should be certified as green or beneficial and which ones should be discouraged. And, so there's great potential there. It's lots of new data, but there's a potential downside, which is, technology isn't the only way of listening to a forest. People whose communities have lived in the forest for centuries or sometimes thousands of years know the forest very well and don't need some little gadget to hang on a tree to be able to tell whether the forest is in good shape or not. So a concern is that if we get too technologically focused, we will forget to ask the very people who know the forest the best and whose lives are intimately connected and whose future well-being is intimately connected with the forest. Those people, often indigenous communities, other communities that live in close relation to the forest, ought to be at the center of decision-making and of data gathering, rather than the old model of conservation, which I'm afraid is still underway in many places, is some technified experts fly in from elsewhere to take a few technological recordings and then leave. So, I think that the new technologies are wonderful in that they provide data on our non-human sisters and brothers. But in listening to too much technology, we may forget to listen to and empower the people who know the forest the best. So there is an environmental justice issue hiding behind these new technologies.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to end with this lovely quote in your book where you say that sound waves are fugitive. And while they're fugitive, the energies and patterns they leave are creative. So I'd like to let you leave us with any parting thoughts, any parting sounds that could lead us into kind of more creativity.
Yes. So, the creativity of sound goes all the way back to the early cosmos. The seeds of the stars that we look up to at night and see in the night sky were actually by the earliest sound waves in the universe. And then sound is the great connector. It connects beings to one another. And then from that, all sorts of wonderful generative possibilities come from connection, because life is made from interconnection, and sound connects us across great distances and in the dark oceans and at nighttime. So there's this great generative capacity. So to receive that generative capacity and to tap it, all we have to do is slow down, even for a few minutes every day, and listen. So I'll close with an invitation, and that is, wherever you are, wherever home is or wherever you're living now, to take a few minutes out of each day and just listen to the world without judgment, without expectation, and maybe even without any curiosity. Just to be in the presence of the sound as an acoustic meditation. See what your responses to that sound are. What sounds are there that you hadn't noticed before? What sounds are there that suggest avenues for future exploration, for future interconnections? So through a practice of listening just for a few minutes each day, I'd encourage everyone to take that on, maybe just for a week. See where it takes you. And it may stimulate curiosity. It may stimulate thoughts about what is broken or beautiful and what you might want to do about that beauty or brokenness. But just let sound do its work by saying yes to listening.
Thanks to David George Haskell for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.